Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon at this session on intersectional discrimination in a post-COVID world. It's really nice to have everyone here and have a few people in the room. Hopefully some people will join us online as well, because this is a hybrid session. So my name is Lauren Avery. I am the Intersectional Disability Project Officer at Minority Rights Group International. Minority Rights Group are an international organisation that works to campaign with and for Indigenous peoples and minorities who are discriminated against, and helps them to get their voices heard. So I am very pleased to be joined today by my colleague Ashraf Medini, who is our Tunisia Advocacy and Legal Officer with us in our Tunisia team at Minority Rights Group. And we are also joined by three fantastic speakers today. Unfortunately, only one of them is in the room, and that would be Sirin Bukadida, who is the LGBTQI Asylum Project Coordinator at the organization Mojadeen, We Exist, which is also based in Tunisia. On the screen, I don't know if you can see our two speakers who are on the screen, but we are joined by Pratima Gurung. Oh, I will introduce Christine first because she's just popped up onto the screen. So Christine Candy, who is the director of the Endorois Indigenous Women's Empowerment Network based in Baringo County in Kenya. And our other speaker who has just joined on the screen is Pratima Gurung, who is the chair of NIDWAN, which is the National Indigenous Disabled Women's Network in Nepal. And she is also General Secretary of the Indigenous Persons with Disabilities Global Network, faculty member at Padma Kanya College in Kathmandu, and she's a Minority Rights Group council member as well. So we're really pleased that we've been able to be joined by these three speakers. Unfortunately, we did have some visa issues for Christine and Pratima, which made it impossible for them to join us today. And this is also something, thinking about a post-COVID world, the difficulties, I can see other people are nodding in the audience, the difficulties that we are having in returning back to normality. And unfortunately, visa issues is one of those things, particularly for people who are located in the global south. So I think that's really important to acknowledge that in a session where we are talking about inclusion. So I would like to just do a little bit of a show of hands to see who we have in the room and what people know about intersectional discrimination, which of course is the focus of our session today. So a quick, and also to wake you up. So a quick show of hands. Who here, who is with us in the room, already works on intersectionality or intersectional discrimination? Just raise your hand if you do. 1, 2, 3-ish. Okay, that's good to know. And the rest of you, there's a few people doing this, so there's a bit of an ish sort of. How many people already have a good understanding of what intersectional discrimination is, aside from the 4 people who are working on this topic? A few more. Okay, this is great. Okay, so when we talk about intersectional discrimination, of course, we have to first start with talking about discrimination, which is, as we all know, unfavorable treatment of one group on the basis of a characteristic. So discrimination has historically been dealt with like this, right? In silos, relating to one characteristic, one identity of a person. But as we all know, we do not live single axis lives. We do not have single axis identities. And so for this reason, this approach to tackling discrimination isn't working for everybody. And the people that it's not working for are the people who are the most marginalized in society, the people who are falling in between the gaps of movements, of ministries, of policies in every area. So the term intersectional discrimination has become quite popular in the past few decades. It's maybe even a bit of a buzzword at the moment. Everyone seems to be talking about it, which is great. But also we have to understand what we mean by intersectional discrimination. What is it? How does it manifest in different contexts? And then what are the solutions to tackling it? Where do we start? Especially at something that is so difficult to conceptualize, I think. And this is one of the reasons why there is not a universally accepted definition of intersectional discrimination, which I can see that many of you are nodding, and so you are aware of this. So when we talk about intersectional discrimination, we can think of one name particularly pops into mind, which is Kimberly Crenshaw. How many of you are already aware of the work of Kimberly Crenshaw? One? Okay. Two? Okay, just to fill everyone else in. Kimberly Crenshaw is a legal scholar based in the US. She's a Black feminist. And it was Kimberly Crenshaw who coined the phrase intersectional discrimination, although the concept had been around for a lot longer. And Kimberly Crenshaw talked about intersectional discrimination in the context of Black women in the employment sector in the US. And she pointed out that Black women in the employment sector were experiencing discrimination that was different to the discrimination that Black men were facing, and different to the discrimination that white women were experiencing. And so for this reason, according to Kimberly Crenshaw's definition, intersectional discrimination is cumulative and qualitatively different or synergistic to other forms of discrimination that are experienced on a single axis. So there is, of course, now growing awareness of intersectional discrimination across different sectors, particularly in the development sector, where this has really been pushed by the work on women and girls and the importance of including women and girls in our development strategies, in access to justice, and in the rule of law. But we're still quite far away, I think, in really understanding what the solutions are to intersectional discrimination. And so this is one of the objectives of our session today, is to have some discussions with you, hear about your ideas as well, whether or not you've been working on intersectional discrimination before. And we're hoping that we will help many more people to see what the importance is of understanding intersectional discrimination and tackling it as well, and giving some examples of the ways in which that can be done. So just to give a little bit of background on the work that's been done so far, there is actually quite a lot of recognition in the international space, in the international human rights mechanisms, such as the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, who have really pushed the agenda on intersectional discrimination, for example, in General Recommendation 28, which sets out the core obligations of states on tackling discrimination against women. So they specifically talk about intersectional discrimination in this general recommendation, because of course women are not just women, they are Indigenous women, women with disabilities, women from minority communities, LGBT women, etc., etc. So it's really important that this work is being done by bodies such as CEDAW. Also, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, in its preamble, sets out multiple and aggravated discriminations that are faced by persons with disabilities, and that's one of the groups we'll also be focusing on today in this session, alongside LGBTQI plus persons. When it comes to national law and legislation, do we have any lawyers in the room? A few, okay, great. I'll have to speak to you afterwards. So when it comes to national legislation, things aren't quite so far ahead in terms of recognition of intersectional discrimination. There is more recognition of multiple discrimination, which is when discrimination is experienced in an additive way. But intersectional discrimination is only recognized, I believe, by one EU member state. So despite the recognition on the international level, I think we've got a really long way to go in recognizing it and tackling intersectional discrimination at the national level, at the local level as well. And of course, all of these are connected, the local level, the national level, the international level. And I think there's some really fantastic work going on at the local level. And we're going to hear from some of our speakers about the work that they are doing around this issue. Just to talk very briefly about the work that Minority Rights Group have been doing with our partners in intersectional discrimination. We have been working on women LGBTQI groups for several years now. And more recently, we have started working on disability as well. And of course, we were always working with the most marginalized groups who are minorities and Indigenous people. And then so when you add another dimension like LGBTQI or disability on top of that, you're really talking about the very most marginalized people and the people who are really the most at risk of being left behind. So when we talk about the SDGs and the slogan, as we all know, is leave no one behind, who are we talking about? And I think what we are trying to do is really address these groups, right? The groups who are really the most at risk of being left behind. And so I'd like to encourage everyone here as well to think about that and think about the work that you're doing in your organizations and how we can push that and come up with some actions today in this sessions to come up with some solutions and actions around these points. So we are going to turn to our speakers now to get their insights on this. And we have a few questions for them. After we have put the questions to our speakers, I will then be handing over to my colleague Ashraf, who is going to take a few questions from the audience. So please be thinking about questions that you might like to ask our panelists. And afterwards, please don't go to sleep because you will be answering questions from our panelists on your ideas, on the actions, and they have prepared some specific questions for you. So we're really looking forward to hearing your voices and hearing what you have to say about these, the issues that are brought up in this session today. So I'm going to start with asking the same question to all of our three panelists. And I think if it's okay with you, Cyrene, I will start with you. And the question is, how do you contextualize intersectional discrimination in your work? Because I think it's really important for such a difficult to understand concept, which I think it is for a lot of people, certainly for the organizations that we work with, for our partners. It can be quite difficult to understand without contextualizing actually how does intersectional discrimination manifest itself. So if you could tell us a little bit about the context that you work in and the challenges that you are facing in terms of intersectional discrimination. Thank you, Cyrene.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Thanks everyone for being here. I think I like to explain things with concrete examples. So maybe I would start with giving an idea about the general context in Tunisia for LGBTIQ+ people, and then go from there to queer refugees and migrants and asylum seekers. I would be using the word queer to summarize LGBTIQ+, because I also prefer this term. I think it's more englobing. So Mawjoudin, We Exist is a queer organization that is officially active since 2015. End of 15 in Tunisia. And it's an organization that works from and for queer people. We work on access to rights. So we do a lot of also lobbying and advocacy work, but at the same time, we do provide services as mental health support, medical support, cash assistance, activities, workshops, capacity building for the community itself. And just to give also a bit like a broader context image, homosexuality is still criminalized in Tunisia, and it's punishable to up to 3 years of imprisonment in Tunisia. This put to the side, in Tunisia, people can still claim asylum and ask for refugee status based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, which is a big contradiction because there is a law that basically criminalizes these people, but at the same time, there is the possibility to ask for asylum. So since 2019, we started the Queer Asylum Project in Tunisia as a way to find a frame to support queer refugees and asylum seekers who are in Tunisia. Also, to a bit of legal context, in Tunisia, there is no national asylum law to provide the necessary protection for this group of people or for refugees in general. So it's the UNHCR who is doing the status determination and the registration of refugees in Tunisia. And like in April 2022, there is the numbers published by the UNHCR say that there is 9,649 individuals registered as refugees and asylum seekers with the UNHCR in Tunisia. It might sound like not a huge number, but for a country like Tunisia with a population of, I think, 11 million at the moment, it's still a big number. And maybe I would say there is no official data from the UNHCR about the number of LGBTIQ+ people, but I got a hint that it's around like 200 to 300 people, because many of the people also, they don't claim asylum based on their sexual orientation only. So in our work, we try to provide the queer refugees and asylum seekers with the same services that we provide for queer people in Tunisia in general, but with a more specific focus and more targeted support, because like here comes the like you already can imagine the discrimination that queer people face in Tunisia, and then adding to that being a refugee or an asylum seeker. And also, so you know, like if you are you have a status of refugee in Tunisia, it only gives you access basically to a card, like a small plastic card that says you are a refugee, nothing else. It doesn't give you access to work. It doesn't give you like, okay, you have access to health services, public health services, but you have to pay and then get reimbursed. And this also, it's a big barrier on how these services are not accessible. So the multiple discriminations that these people are facing are, like, just to name a few, gender-based violence, discrimination for their gender identity and sexual orientation, also from a structural level. For example, trans people have no rights. There is no possibility to have access to hormone therapy. There is no possibility to have access to a medical follow-up or to officially transition and change their names, for example. There is the non-accessibility of the services when it comes to language, to financial means to access these services, and also the physical spaces are not accessible. There is the fear of persecution still, because you are seeking asylum in a country where you can be persecuted for the reason why you seek asylum. There is the economical violence and the people don't have the right to work. So they have to work in really bad conditions and they have to accept the terms of the person giving them the job. What else? And then comes also all the systemic violence from the police, from all the state structures, and adding to that the impossibility to access to justice, because if you have been harassed or arrested by a police officer, you cannot just go to the same police station and make a complaint about these people, because first you will be again persecuted for daring to do that, and secondly, because of your identity, you risk to be persecuted as well. So there is no possibility to access structures that can give you the possibility to make a complaint or something like this. And that's where the civil society comes in, and organizations like ours come somehow to fill in the gap that the system is creating. For example, I would like to finish with this, the topic of COVID, for example. When the pandemic hit and there was a huge lockdown in the country, refugees and asylum seekers were not a priority of the state, even though they included them in the vaccination campaigns. But all the information about COVID and all the information about the vaccinations were in Arabic. And many of these refugees are not Arabic speakers. So they cannot access the information, they don't know where to go. Also, another issue that we faced is that the UNHCR and its local partners, they did vaccination campaigns, which was great, but then these people are not registered on the official records. They don't have the vaccination pass that now we all need to move to places, to access spaces. They don't have this because it was not done in the official way. Just to name a few of the issues that LGBTIQ+ people are facing in Tunisia, and how the different layers of discrimination and exclusion of the public sphere are piling up. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sirine. So it really is compounded discrimination that you're talking about, just the list of issues that you went through that are facing asylum seekers. And just to highlight, of course, that we all know that this is not just the case for asylum seekers and refugees in Tunisia, but it's the same situation in many countries around the world who are hosting refugees, or in countries where people are fleeing. So thank you so much for those insights, and we will ask you a little bit more about some of the solutions that you're proposing and some of the work that you're doing, because it's really very important, as I'm sure everyone will agree. And I'm really glad that you also brought up COVID, because also we are talking about a post-COVID world, right? So we need to start thinking, and we already are thinking, about how things might look differently once the pandemic comes to a close. At what point that is, I'm not sure where we draw the line, but so on that note, I think we will move on to Pratima, and I'd like to ask Pratima the same question, really. So how does intersectional discrimination manifest in the context that you work, and what were the exacerbations that the COVID-19 pandemic brought to the situation of Indigenous women with disabilities in Nepal? Pratima, over to you.
Thank you, Lauren, and very humble to be in this rich discussion. I'm very much honored to express my opinion about intersectionality. And I would just like to highlight, when it comes to, as you have been framing about the intersectionality coming from the sociological to the gender studies, and now we see that it has really been a very buzzword and a very sexy word in the human rights framework and in the development framework. But when we try to see this word into our lives and the realities, and when it comes to the different and multiple intersecting identities, I just wanted to highlight about the different kinds of, the recognitions of the complex way that an individual faces in his or her life, and which is very much cumulative in terms of different forms and aspects. And this is where I just want to relate my work. I work for young Indigenous women with disabilities through an organization called National Indigenous Disabled Women Association. And we realized during the disaster that happened in Nepal, that was in 2015 earthquake situation, young Indigenous women with disabilities were not in a very safe enabling space, not only because that they lost their wheelchairs or they lost their assistive devices, which was very much crucial for living their dignified life, but at the same time, we also realized that those individuals were also facing very insecure positions by their own colleagues and by their own family members. And this is how they had to stay in a very open space. And they realized the different kind of identities that grapple in different forms and aspects. And this is how the organizations have been working. And when it comes to, again, what are the kind of impact, how does it impact to young Indigenous women and girls with disabilities? I just wanted to reflect on the socio-cultural aspects relating with the structural and systematic, historical and indirect discriminations that an individual faces due to the multiple and intersecting identities. And this is again related with the lived experience, how an individual perceives all those aspects, whether the individual is able to perceive those lens, because we realize that though the intersectionality has become a very buzzword from the very Western framework and discourse, but when it comes to the global South, we still find the challenges that the individual is again framed with a single axis. And this is where I would just again try to connect this with the national legislations and the policies that we have at the national level, because it only sees the policy, the existing policies and the framework sees me, myself as a woman, not as an Indigenous woman with disabilities. And this is how, when it comes to, again, Indigenous women and also women with disabilities, the nexus of collective rights versus individual rights, the nexus of gender, disability, indigeneity, these are not part of the discussion at the national level, not even at the part of the national policies and the framework. And this is where we realize that it's not only the challenges that we face as an individual in our day-to-day lives with different kind of realities and unsafe and multiple times of discriminations and violence that happens in our day-to-day lives. But at the same time, we also face the very structural discrimination, the institutional discrimination to frame this agenda. And I would also like to reframe that we see that when it comes to groups like multiple and intersecting identities, even they are not able to realize and they're not able to see those different layers that impacts their day-to-day lives. And this is where I see the conversation, the discussion, the co-creating of the spaces from different UN agencies in the later phase after 1990s has begun so far at the global level. But again, when the global level discussions has been trickled down at the grassroots level, we still find there is a huge gap of understanding, realizing, and also of feeling the principle of human rights like non-discrimination and equality. And this is where we see the role of effective and meaningful participation, because these multiple and intersecting individuals who are facing these challenges in their day-to-day lives, whether they are able to amplify their experiences, their voices in different forums or not, that is still a kind of question. And this is where I would say that the role of our small organizations has to play is to bring those avenues and lens to frame the agenda at the broader level, because we realize that the existing siloed framework does not address the experience that we face in multiple forms and aspects, whether it might be direct or indirect. When it comes to, I would say, when it comes to intersecting discrimination, I would say most often it is not visible, it is invisible and in an indirect form. And this is where the universal accepted definitions of human rights has to be, what do you say, framed in that way. And this is where we see that in the later phase, that the concluding observation, including the general recommendations, the general comments on different international human rights instruments like the CERD, the CRPD, the CEDAW have come across through. And this has really opened the avenues for working us at the grassroots level. But I would again say that when it comes to the individuals who are facing multiple and intersecting identities, there is a huge gap to be addressed in terms of the realities and experiences they experience in their day-to-day lives. But at the same time, it is also required to reframe the narratives of those experiences. So I'll just stop here and happy to hear further conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratima. One of the things you said I thought was really interesting when you mentioned that the people themselves don't even recognize the multiple layers of discrimination that are facing them. And I think that is one of the things that is important to highlight. And some of the work that we have been doing that we will talk about a little bit later is actually bringing groups together. So bringing Indigenous groups together with the disability rights groups, bringing minority groups together with disability rights groups. And I'm sure it's probably the same in the context of asylum seekers and queer activists as well. And actually building those connections between movements, between civil society, and also between policymakers, government departments as well. So we can talk about that as some of the solutions a little bit later. So now I would like to hear from Christine Candy, who is also working with Indigenous peoples and people with disabilities in the context of Baringo County in Kenya. So Christine, could you tell us a little bit about the situation in Baringo County in Kenya for Indigenous people with disabilities, and just share a little bit about some of the challenges that are facing and how intersectional discrimination manifests in that context?
Thank you so much, Lauren, and the rest of the team for lending me an ear to bring with you today the perspective of Baringo in regards to Enroy's community. So as you've heard, I'm Christine Gandia, Executive Director of Enroy's Indigenous Women Empowerment Network. This is an organization that works for the rights of women and persons with disabilities. Our coming into space was to bridge the gap that exists because our community had a long struggle for land rights after being evicted from their ancestral home, that is Lake Bogoria. So this community was evicted way back in 1973 to pave way for government to do tourism activities, turn our ancestral land into a tourism site. And we had a long struggle for justice up to African Commission with the help of MRG, another organization. And afterwards, we had a ruling, and this ruling was to recognize us as a distinct community, distinct from the rest of the communities here in Kenya. So here in Kenya, we have 42 tribes recognized, but our community is yet to be recognized as a distinct community. So in that regard, that one became a challenge. Now that we are coming from a perspective of being a person with disabilities. So we were also required to give government to give us our land and even to implement the decision to the fullest. So one of the key challenges that I realized is because when we went for community meetings, I realized that when we talk about the issues of Enroy's case, we talk about implementation, we talk about frustration we undergo in implementing the case. Afterwards, after the meeting, women and persons with disabilities would come to me and tell me their unique kind of challenges they are facing. So, and I saw the only way is to have an organization that talks about the needs that have been affecting them, or to bring together those challenges and try to collectively look for a solution. So in Baringo, or rather in Enroy's community, we have in concluded census that was done in 2019, in Baringo County alone, we had around 16,000 persons with disabilities, and countrywide we have like 900,000 persons with disabilities. So when it comes to issues that have been affecting them is access to services. So services include access to education, access to health facilities, access to good road networks to carry them around or to access, because there are different kinds of disabilities that exist within the community. And when it comes to service delivery from the government usually interact with its citizens through different forums like public participation. So what happens in that is that there is no, the way programs are being packaged within the government is that they don't consider that there are people who have a special needs, like those people who are deaf, or those people who are blind, or person who has who are physically challenged, and many others, all those kind of disabilities, because when you go there, accessibility of those forums is usually a challenge. And they have a perception that, you know, the general public normally feels that the forums is for the citizen, and as person with disability, we are a little bit far away, or we are pushed away from those decisions. So one of the key issues about person with disability and intersectionality is that there is really a great challenge when it comes to inclusivity. And we've attached this one to the capacity, because through our work within Baringo, we realize that most of the state actors, stakeholders, do not understand the importance of inclusiveness. So we really trying to do a lot of capacity build, both for the community, so that they can have receptive or can have a reasonable accommodation when it comes to giving them chance to person with disability, and even understanding, because coming from an indigenous community is that they really attach a person with disability to a lot of casts or customs that maybe they are being punished for wrongdoing. So, and they are not even given chance to go to school. Some of the community members deny or lock person with disability in their houses, so that they cannot go to school because they are ashamed of having a child with disability. So to that become a great challenge. So we work around the community, doing a lot of sensitization, doing a lot of discussion, or teaching them the importance of having a child with disability, because a child is a child at the end of the day. He has coherent rights like any other person, and need not to be discriminated from the fact that it is a person with disability. So we do a lot of capacity building, community education, even with the state actors. And when it comes to employment, we realize that it is a key challenge, because at the end of the day, when it comes to employment threshold, most organizations, including even private and the government, and even NGOs, don't consider a person with disabilities in their employment categories, because you realize that they are being given the same threshold. Even if you are a person with disability, they don't consider that maybe because you are coming from a rural area or you are coming from an indigenous background, there are a lot of barriers that maybe have hindered someone in accessing education. And now that in our education system, they don't consider a person with disabilities. I remember when I was in school, those days, when I was doing my Kenya Certificate of Secondary Education, and even doing my primary education before being enrolled into secondary education, there was no, in that form you are keying in, there was no place that they maybe require us to maybe register ourselves as a person with disability. So I was enrolled in a rural school where there was no road network. We could only access by trekking to school. So that one became a key challenge, and maybe getting into those spaces, going to those schools again, people would look you, and maybe in a way they are suggesting to you that you are not a member of this school just because you are able differently, and they believe that people with disability have certain limitation when it comes to going to school. Maybe school is only for those who are physically fit and all those. So one of the key issue and challenge when it comes to being a person with disability and coming from an indigenous background is community reception, including even with the government official. It becomes so difficult for them to understand that they need to be accorded a space just like any other human being. So maybe a little bit, I can even talk about the issues of COVID-19, how it came about information package and passage of information to different people around the country. When it comes to even membership and representation at different spaces, it becomes a challenge because at the end of the day, you find that in most of the government leadership positions, persons with disabilities are left out from engaging in political spaces, just because the way Prathama has just seen is that maybe they feel that like when they are doing their planning, they usually leave behind consideration to have a person with disabilities in those political spaces, even at, because this one become a challenge when it comes to organizing for different political seats around the country. Most recently, as an organization, we did a political leadership and political leadership training here in Kenya. So we went to the level of meeting with different political leaders, meeting with the non-state actors, and even different commissions that are aligned to working with persons with disabilities. And we realized that they usually work with persons with disabilities from a majority community, leaving behind persons with disabilities from indigenous communities. So here in Kenya, in learning from 2017 elections, there was nominative and elective position that were reserved for persons with disabilities in every county assembly and even at National Assembly. But you realize that those spaces were taken by some of the leaders coming from majority communities. And again, we had a challenge because 17 county assembly could not consider a person with disabilities in their county assembly, and that one became a cap. So when it comes to a person with disabilities coming from a rural areas, for example, is that when it comes to budget allocation and budget disbursement, you realize that in those items, the county prioritize. You will miss items that touches with persons with disabilities, or you miss voices for persons with disabilities. So, for example, I can even talk about the issues of COVID-19. When disaster comes, it affects everyone. But when in the process of recovery and all that, you realize that the government could put in place incentives so that they can jumpstart the economy to bring back economy and other social development within the country. But to realize that those who benefit and those who maybe being considered in those economy recovery strategies is that you realize that in those strategies, they leave behind persons with disabilities, and considering that in every disaster that affects us, the people who are most vulnerable are persons with disabilities. So we need to maybe a little bit look onto those issues and try to maybe come up with a global way of when it comes to issues affecting people, there should be a special regards to a person with disabilities. So access to information become one of the key impediments when it comes to reaching out to the needs of persons with disabilities, because most information are not accessed. In most public primary schools here in Kenya, they do not offer brailles and other learning material for persons with disabilities. So that one becomes a challenge for a child with disabilities in indigenous community and even in other development or in other areas. So those are the issues, and now disability manifests itself. So I can even talk about a person with disability, a woman person with disability in a rural community, in my indigenous community, because in those communities, in my community, you find that you have to trek for a long distance to get water. You have to go for firewood, maybe in the forest. And again, you have to look after animals. So the role of a woman is to maybe take care of animals, take care of children and all that. So what does that look like when you are a person with disability? The challenges become doubles up, and maybe at most of the time, they are not married, no. Yeah, people look at persons with disabilities as unproductive in society. So there are a lot of challenges when it comes to being a woman and then being a person with disability in an indigenous community. You suffer like double challenges more than any other person. And now considering that in this process, we are indigenous community, which had a long struggle for land. So you see now, when the government were evicting communities from my community from ancestral land, so persons with disabilities, some of them were banned in their houses. So you see the kind of frustration and challenges we go through. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. It's really, really interesting to hear about the context in the daily lives of Indigenous women with disabilities. And thank you as well for sharing your experiences in education as well. I think this is also helps us to understand how intersectional discrimination presents in these contexts, right? And also thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic and the impacts that were felt by these communities for the very reasons that you said, Christine, which was lack of representation in these spaces by these people. And it's not just lack of representation in the disability space, but it's also lack of representation in the Indigenous space or in the health policy space. And so, yeah, I think lack of representation is definitely something that we need to think about in inclusion as well in these spaces when we think about the solutions. So I'm very aware that we would really like to take some questions from the audience, but just very quickly, I'd like to pass back to Cyrene and ask a little bit about some of the solutions that you can come up with, or that some of the solutions that you can think of, or some of the solutions that you've been implementing as well in your work. And then I think I will pass on afterwards to Atref to take some questions from the audience.
It's a difficult question. Like, even though solutions are always welcome, but I feel the solution should be more on the structural level and more on the like bigger, higher level that would touch the, like, you know, it's like decisions that come really from up that would change a lot in the daily life of people. Like if we manage to decriminalize homosexuality, for example, that could be a solution. If we abolish borders, that could be a solution. If we have people like able to move where they want to be and feel safe, that would be a solution. But more on a concrete, more concrete level, what we are able at least to do is to provide spaces. And I think spaces are important for representativity, for visibility, for voicing challenges and difficulties. And that's something we are really like trying to achieve in like sometimes just providing the physical space for a group of people to meet and to hang out, cook something nice and chat, or providing, for example, when the independent expert on SOGIESC was on visit in Tunisia, we of course invited queer refugees and asylum seekers to also voice their issues directly to the to Victor Madrigal, because it was important that their voice are also heard. We do provide our services without or like as much as we can equally to all the people who request it. We have very limited financial capacities, and we cannot, like, we will never be able to fill in all the gaps within the system. We do provide health assistance, we do provide cash assistance, we do cover rent. Sometimes we cover for therapy, for mental health support, because we think it's also super important to provide this kind of support. We do provide also capacity building workshops and training, so the people can also learn about their rights and how to access them, and also they can be multiplicating the work and sharing the information with their communities as well. So these are like some of the solutions we are trying to work on. We also try to work on the structural level by doing advocacy and lobbying and trying to reach the people like who are concerned about decision making. We try to stay in somehow a collaboration or like at least an exchange with the UNHCR in the Tunisian context. We try to voice all the critiques and challenges that we see, and to also bring it up to the UNHCR and also to like the UN mechanisms. That's something we are working on at the moment, because there is like violations even within the asylum system and like how it's happening in Tunisia. So these are like some of the solutions that we try to do as much as we can.
Thank you. That's I completely agree with what you're saying, as I'm sure many people in the room were, about the solutions we need at the structural level, right, the high level, but also thinking about community solutions as well and trying to link those together. So we can talk more about solutions. So I'm going to pass on to Ashraf now, who's going to invite some questions from the audience.
Hello, everyone. This is Ashraf. Thank you, Lauren, for presenting, and thank you, Celine, for suggesting some of the solutions that are relevant for the framework of your work with Mawjoudeen. We will now move to the more interactive part, where we get to ask, to get questions and answers. I would like to welcome any questions or any insights that the audience would like to share with us. And yeah, feel free, please, to step up if you have any questions. Could you kindly come here to the microphone, please, so we can...
And if you cannot come to the microphone, or you would like us to bring a microphone to you, please just give us a wave, okay?
Yes, please.
Okay. Is it working? Perfect. Hi, my name is Joe Malouf. I come from Lebanon. I'm the founder and president of Karama, a human dignity union. We mainly work for any kind of human rights. But I wanted to ask Serine, when you talked about the solutions, what is the situation, or how is the media supporting what you are talking about? Because in Lebanon, 10 years ago, the situation was more difficult than today. And to be honest, I really respect supporting LGBTQ in finding houses sometimes when there's violence at home because of their sexual identity, or supporting them financially, etc. But this is never the solution, and I think you agree with me. In Lebanon, the situation changed when we, as public figures or media figures, each one of us, we did put pressure on the government, and we did some awareness campaigns and changed the perception of the majority of the population, and specifically the more progressive people in Lebanon. And after that, the law did not change. It is still a crime, but for the past 4 or 5 years, no one is arrested for his sexual identity. We have one queer club in Lebanon, a big club that takes up to 1,500 persons. 10 years ago, they were always raided by the police and etc. After what we did through the media, because the media plays a big role in shaping societies, from, let's say, the last 4 or 5 years, this club is treated normally like any other nightclub in the country. And the situation became better. Even some judges, they did not apply what the law says in some cases, and the rulings are now used in a lot of other chambers. So don't you believe and agree with me that something different has to happen in all advancing countries? Like, we need new solutions. It's not working. It hasn't been working.
Yeah, like I would answer directly. I think I would agree with you that we need to get creative, more creative. And something we have been using as a strategy, like, of course, the media discourse is slowly changing. Some of them are adopting a more inclusive discourse, a less discriminatory discourse, which is helpful. But for example, what we use as a strategy with Mawjoudeen is art. And this is helpful. We have, since 2018, a queer film festival that is happening in Tunis, and it's open to the public. And since a few weeks, we have a theater play that talks about the struggles of LGBT people. And this is also open to the public. And now the media is talking about it in a really positive way as a form of like expression. And that's, there is this population that needs to be heard. And there is this population that like the suffering needs to stop. And this is also relayed like by public media, by super mainstream media layout. So.
But what do you think is still missing when it comes to, let's say, arresting a queer person? Like, would the media go down to the police station or do some reports or put really pressure on the government or on the persons who are responsible? Or I'm addressing my question to you because you are the only guest that is talking about this, but I know it's the case in a lot of other countries also.
Like practically, because it's complex, like how people get arrested based on their homosexuality, because they need to be caught within the act. And most of the people who are arrested and charged for homosexuality, they have been basically arrested because of so like not respecting the social norms, or like, and this is a very vague text that any judge can interpret however they want. And that's the issue also, because, okay, you look a bit more feminine, you are supposed to be like fitting into this masculine traits, and then you are arrested for this because your behavior didn't, like the police guy didn't like your behavior. And then they would dig into your phone, your contacts and stuff, and then make links that you might be gay, and then you get arrested for this. So it's complex, and there is work that's being done about like, don't mind my business, like I dress however I want and stuff, but it's still not, I think not enough work is being done directly to the general population. Like, okay, there is a big group of people who are more like aware, less conservative, open-minded, whatever you want to call it, that of course are super accepting to whatever non-conforming appearance or behavior. But when it comes to the lower scale, I think there needs to be more direct, I don't know how to call it, like dialogue maybe, just like talking to the people, addressing these issues and learning tolerance from a really, I think, education also for the future generations, that they should also learn what does it mean to be inclusive, what does it mean to respect other people regardless of how they are. And I think this still needs to be done as well.
One last quick question, I just need one more minute. You as an organization and the members that are working to help the whole community, aren't you facing also a kind of pressure, and how are you protecting yourselves in the country?
Difficult one, because when you work on an issue and at the same time you have just the mental pressure that you have to go on and to be there for others, and then at the same time face the same discrimination as these people, it's difficult. I think in Tunis, after the revolution, there is a minimum standard of respecting human rights and like the right to be active, to organize in organizations and stuff. So this at least is being still respected. And I think this gives us a little bit of protection. We also rely on like our networks, international networks and stuff like this, because in case something happens, we would need support. But it's never stable, especially with an unstable political situation with a president who just decides things randomly somehow. So it's a fragile situation. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Cyrine. I would like just to highlight that, like with regards to the media situation, there is an independent instance in Tunisia that deals with claims that if there was like a discriminatory speech on TV or something, the instance is supposed to tackle these issues and even give fines to the TV channels that portrayed these hateful speech and discriminatory speeches. Now, what happens in reality is that it could be applicable, yes, but not when it comes to LGBT people and queer people. So the fact that the law is still criminalizing the situation is also impacting the application of the guidelines of this independent instance. So for instance, they would go and find people if there was racial discrimination, but they wouldn't do the same if it was homophobic. So I think connecting the law and the media is something that would make both ways go together, in the sense of if it was decriminalized and if there was a protection, like a law that protects against discrimination, then that could be applicable in future cases where there is homophobic content on TV, because now it just goes with total tolerance and with total like compromise and silence. So yeah. Thank you, everyone. I would like to welcome more questions if there are more questions. And like Lauren mentioned, we are also more than happy to bring the microphone to you if you don't feel comfortable coming there, or if you can't come there, we can do that. So please feel free to ask any more questions. Okay, perfect.
Thank you. So my name is Nicholas from Project Expedite Justice. We're a legal nonprofit working on redress mechanisms for minorities and vulnerable communities, IPs included, right? So my question at this point, we have an IP project coming on conservation areas, human rights violations, and so on. And we're looking at redress mechanisms at the moment. Is how, when you look at redress mechanisms, to include intersectionality, right? Because this could be a primarily indigenous issue, but you don't want to add a layer of intersectional discrimination or perpetuate the situation if you can solve it from the get-go, including this layer. This would be mainly for Christine and Fatima, but of course the insight of all of you is more than welcome and appreciated. Thank you.
If Christine or Pratima would like to answer the question, please. I don't know if you were able to hear the question properly, or we...
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
So I can go ahead and maybe Christine can add on this point. So for me, I would say definitely, as I've already explained, when it comes to indigenous people's rights and also human rights, we look at the dimension of individual and collective rights, where we try to identify the intersectional dimensions and less, and this means that we are framing them in the document, in the policies that are being affected by those individuals. I would also like to highlight some of the very practical examples that we have been implementing at the grassroots level, is also practicing solidarity. And when I say practicing solidarity, I would like to emphasize about the cross-movement collaborations within and beyond the constituency, like in the disability constituency, within the indigenous constituency, gender and other constituency, but at the same time also building empathy to enable the right holders and also inclusion and full effective participations of those persons are very much crucial. And when we try to see that how do we address those intersectional dimension, I would highlight about the very holistic and structural approach, where we look not only where we look inclusion in a very broader perspective that includes intercultural perspectives, and which includes the rights of indigenous people, including persons with disabilities or women from different identities. We also see to have co-creating spaces faced by those individuals. And when we say co-creating spaces, I would also like to highlight that those individuals who are facing intersectional and multiple layers of discriminations, their voices are being heard and amplified. But when it comes to projects and different kinds of framework, the disaggregated data which we have been number of times advocating at the grassroots level to address the visible inequalities faced by those people are very much crucial. So in the process of collecting, analyzing those data, those forms and patterns are very much crucial. But at the same time, when you talk about the programs and projects, the designing, the planning, the implementations, the monitoring and the evaluation of a phase, all these are very much crucial to have their voices and to have their effective and meaningful participations, not just a token representations, because we see in the reality that most often those with multiple and intersecting identities are most often their representations are still not engaged in a very meaningful way. And this is where I would see a collective effort of advocacy for raising awareness related on human rights, including sexism, racism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia. So these are the kind of things that we have been doing at the grassroots level. We are also supporting with different kinds of non-stake and stakeholders working in collaboration with different types of international instruments, like the concluding observations of the CEDAW and the CRPD, including the CRC. So this has really been very crucial for us to make a ground, to build the foundations, to amplify our voices. And this is where we can bring the synergy of different partners. And when I say partners, I realize from the right holders perspective, including the multi-stakeholders engagement from different aspects. So it would be very much crucial in terms of understanding these layers of discriminations that we face. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratima. Now I would like to see if there's any one last question that we can take from the audience. Please go ahead, Christine.
Yes, I wanted also to maybe add my voice in regards to the question on the issues of conservation and redress. On how we try to include the issues of intersectionality. So what we've done in my community is that we've done a community education whereby we are integrating person with disability voice into the structures that exist within the community. That is one way we've tried to achieve. And again, having women as champions of different level of things happening within the community. Like, for example, on issues of conservation, we have specific women that are geared towards conserving the environment within the community. We have specific women that are geared to do issues of socio-economic development within themselves. They are who do business around Lake Bogoria. So they sell their own handcraft work. So we also have representation of women, maybe starting from the local level. So some women have started growing their leadership. So growing leadership to participate in different development happening at the country level. Some of them aspire to be leaders. So, you know, in Kenya right now, we are running a political calendar whereby we are going to have our election in August. So some of them have run in political parties primaries. We are trying also as an organization, because we were preparing ourselves for election and we wanted to ensure that no one was left behind, is that we prepare our persons with disabilities, leaders from 4 counties. We are able to train them on opportunities that exist or that comes with an election, and maybe equip them with the necessary knowledge so that they can, like any other person, participate and benefit from this election. So we've also, through a research, because my organization was most recently engaged in a research on the status of health and education, whereby we do the research and use the outcome of the research to influence decision at the county level. We met with the county officials who works on the budget and the Department of Education. We shared with the outcome of the research, and some of them committed themselves to to follow up certain critical issues that they found that it was of concern, and it was indeed affecting persons with disabilities and women in Indigenous community. And again, we did a petition to the National Assembly, whereby our issues, we took persons with disabilities and women and the general community members to be part of the people who went to the Senate, House of Senate in Nairobi to share our petition. And most of the issues that were spoken by the community were presented by myself and other community members. So it is something that we are trying to integrate women's voice in our daily happening, and even trying to ensure that we integrate persons with disabilities needs when it comes to community needs. So that is the only way we will ensure that the person with disabilities and the community have reasonable accommodation. So when it comes to reparation, you said is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, we play a very critical role by assisting the less fortunate within the community, by educating them. So we were able to interpret some of the information that maybe persons with disabilities could not understand. People with mental challenges, we could easily maybe use the language that they could easily understand that COVID-19 was really a disaster. And at the moment, because we are faced with so many disasters, we are going to an extent of considering of forming a disaster committee within our community, whereby we will ensure that most of the membership are persons with disabilities, because, you know, for a long time, persons with disabilities and women have been seen from an angle of being victim, and people are not seeing the valuable or because, you know, these people that are talents, they can showcase. This one is by giving them chance, giving them space. And the only thing we are doing as an organization is to have a space. And one of the key things we are trying to do at the moment is to have a capacity for all state and non-state actors, starting this from our locality, so that we influence some of the state officials who see the importance of integrating the voice of persons with disability. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. Now we would like to move to the second part of our interactive activity. And I would like to ask our panelists to ask the audience a question or two regarding actions that could be taken or solutions that could be suggested by the audience. So I would like, if I don't know if Celine would like to start, that would be.
Yeah, I know it's difficult, but I would like to hear, like, if you have experience with similar work, if you have ideas, if you have done in the past actions, or if you have done, like, if you have led projects or something like this related to the topics we talked about, or like, at least in my case with LGBTIQ+, refugees and migrant rights, I would like to hear from you, because it's always interesting to hear from different experiences, different perspectives, to also have an exchange and come up and get more creative also. Thank you.
Again, feel free to tell me to bring the microphone. If you don't feel comfortable, come in here to speak. So, yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for this session today. It was very interesting. My name is Melanie Canovas, and I'm a program officer at Lawyer Without Borders France. And we have a project in Samos, so it's in an island located close to Turkey, so that's why there is a lot of asylum-seekers that come in there. And we have a project on legal assistance. So we have a legal center, and a lot of those people, well, they seek asylum, but they are facing a lot of other issues related either to the gender or to their sexual orientation or disability or other issues. So what we do is that we provide them with a safe space. So it's for women especially. And also we have a workshop with other NGOs to see how we could provide them with an holistic assistance. So because we only do legal assistance, but they need other help, assistance, like psychosocial aspects or health. So that's why we have, partnership with other organizations. And we also try to do advocacy and to send letter to the Greek ombudsman. But well, once again, it's very frustrating because it's not really working. It's usually a lot of the time we don't have any answer from the ombudsman. So yeah, that's another thing that is frustrating because, well, when you try to do advocacy, it's not working because it's a very hot topic. So yeah, that's what we do. So very, as you mentioned, community, I mean, local, not with the government activities, but yeah, that's what we try to do in Samos. Thank you.
Thank you. This is very insightful. I would like to welcome Christina or Pratima if they would like to ask the audience a question as well. Please feel free to do so. Christine, you're muted if you are trying to ask a question.
My question to the audience is that it is a little bit hard to ask, but let me try. We are talking about intersectionality. We are talking about the issues that have been affecting us. We are talking about the voice that has been left behind. And we've really shared our experience. So my question is, have you interacted maybe in your workplace or in your communities or in your country? Have you interacted with such characteristics that we've given to you today about different layers of discrimination or that connect together and maybe define a person? Have you ever interacted with those kind, and maybe if you interacted, what kind of solution have you tried to offer? Because I think all of us are positioned to, maybe because the discrimination we are talking about, discrimination that was maybe decided by society and implemented by all of us. So my question is, if you've interacted with, what kind of solution have you tried to offer?
So I can repeat. Yes, I can repeat.
Okay.
Exactly. So if there was an interaction within the framework of your work about characteristics that we mentioned today within intersectional discrimination, and if yes, what are the solutions that you have used or that you are using, again, in the framework of your positions regarding this question? So if anyone would like to step, yes, please go ahead. Yes, of course. Okay. Perfect. Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you so much. Hi, my name is Laura Newman. I'm with the Carter Center, which is an NGO in Atlanta, Georgia, led by former President Jimmy Carter. And we have a program on, you mentioned it, Christine, on access to information and women. And equally, we work in Bangladesh with Dalit women, so some of the most marginalized women. So the work that we've been doing is really, we had started with a study in 3 different countries across 3 different continents that demonstrated that women are largely excluded from information flows, and identified those obstacles. And as you say, with intersectionality, whether that's marginalized because of Indigenous, we've also found rural women are equally impacted by this, as well as, of course, some of the other intersectionalities. So we work with government and civil society on ways to reach women with this critical information. Most recently, we started including in Tunis in 24 global cities, working with mayors on how can they identify underutilized services and reach women with information about that, whether it's about services for sexual and gender-based violence or economic opportunities, waste management, whatever services they provide. And we found that to be even more impactful than the work that we're doing at a national level because it's so much more present. And I think the more localized, what we're finding is the more local you get, the more impact we're showing, because that's really what most of the people that we work with want. They want the most local information. And only just one last thing to say, you were asking, I think earlier about national policies, and I would encourage people to look at Canada's policy. They have a gender-based plus policy where they have to take every piece of legislation, every policy, anything that impacts people and put it through a gender-based lens that also adds all the different intersectionalities to it. And it's intense, but it's amazing at what they've been able to actually modify in their own policies because of really intentionally looking at that intersectionality.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. So I would like to move on to the last part. And I would like for you to see with me on the screen, there will be displayed the concluding remarks of the session.
Yeah, I've been trying to take some notes. That's what I've been doing on my laptop here,
Yes.
is to capture some of the ideas that that Atref will go through on the screen. But one of the sections, I'm not sure which part you are viewing. Oh, you can see here. So I've tried to capture some of the solutions here, which we've discussed. But you can see this part at the bottom is lacking some actions. But I would like to propose one action before Atref summarizes, which is to continue some of these conversations that we've been having, because hearing from some of the people in the room who have proposed solutions and talked about the work that you are doing. And I'm sure there's many more people who didn't speak but are sitting there thinking, actually, we're doing similar work, or we've got some things that might work for you. So one action that I would like to propose, which I will write down now, is to invite some conversations with some of you moving forward with us and with our partners to share ideas moving forward.
Thanks, Lauren. Now, if you could go up, please, to the... Thank you. So for the solutions, how can intersectional discrimination be challenged? So as we mentioned before, it's through practicing solidarity and more empathy, and that's very crucial in the framework of intersectional discrimination. As our friend from Lebanon also mentioned, the role of media in changing public opinion with regards in particular to the question of LGBT rights. So that could be one of the solutions that challenge intersectional discrimination. Involving multi-level stakeholders as well is one of the concrete solutions that could be undertaken to challenge discrimination. Collecting data on intersectionality to allow nuanced analysis is also one of the solutions that could be taken, and building relationships with governments, organizations, departments, and sensitizing them to intersectional issues. And this is particularly with like-minded government organizations, because unfortunately it's not possible when you are trying to challenge something that is being imposed by a structure that is feeding that intersectional discrimination and not willing to address it. So that's particularly relevant with like-minded governments and organizations. Regarding the redress mechanisms, it's important to co-create spaces to amplify voices and to encourage the participation of marginalized groups in generating solutions, redress mechanisms from the get-go. To conclude, it's also particularly important to train women and women with and people with disabilities in general to be leaders and to target or to take specific actions and targets to include them in conservation projects. With these solutions, I would like to conclude our session today because I think we ran out of time. And I would like to thank you all for your presence today. It was very insightful and very good to interact with you. And I would like to continue this conversation maybe later after the session or at any other occasions. Please feel free to approach us and like to continue this conversation. I would like to thank our panelists, Sirine, Pratima, and Christine, and Lauren for her efforts as well. And thank you, everyone. And yeah, this is, thank you.